Sociolinguistic perspectives on interlanguage. Within this evaluation of sociolinguistic approach, we will also look at what does it think of the interlanguage and compare in comparison with other approaches. Now, if we compare it with other approaches, we find that the functionalist tradition or the functionalist perspective has paid little attention to social interaction or social context. Now, while they talk about the functions of a language in different contexts, it does not really pay much attention to the interaction within it. It just pays attention to the function that is in mind of the learners and what is it that they want to do with the language. So speech is not seen as speech events, they are seen as speech acts. So language to do something. In the interactionist tradition, we find that there has been systematic analysis of interaction. People have studied second language interaction. There have been a lot of quantitative studies in which they have tried to see that what goals have been achieved and what functions have been achieved through interactions and what type of negotiations has led to a second language and how does it actually help second language acquisition. So interactionists look at the significance of interaction and how does it lead to the learning of the second language. You have ethnographers of language communication within the socio-linguistic perspective. Now, these people have done holistic studies, in-depth studies. These are multi-layered studies looking at different contexts, individual contexts, social contexts, looking within context within the classrooms, outside the classrooms. These are multi-layered studies, very insightful. And then these studies actually also look at the link between linguistic and non-linguistic aspects of communication, gestures, pragmatics. They have also looked at it in detail. So the variationist, remember we talked about the variation, how within the sociolinguistic perspective, some researchers are interested in the variation of language. They have looked at micro-linguistic features, as we discussed about that before. And in the interlanguage also, they have looked at the changes or the micro-level changes in the interlanguage system of the learners. So in that way, they provide us more detail of what goes on in the interlanguage. They demonstrate that also that variability, or that is that difference between individual learners is patterned, it's not random, and it happens because of certain things, and this variation is linked to social factors. It is the social context that determines these differences. Now, let me remind you that the interactionist approach also looked at the interlanguage, but it looked at interlanguage to see how interlanguage developed because of or as a result of the interactions through negotiations. How did the learners actually appropriate their language system? Sociocultural theory also looked at interlanguage of the learners, but they looked at more detail of how scaffolding, how within the ZPD, if the language scaffolding comes to the learners, how do they reconstruct, readjust their forms? But for them, learning was not a result of interactions. it was within the interactions. So sociocultural theory brought the context within or on in the center stage of our learning. Your sociolinguistic approach links the social and factors with the linguistic changes that are occurring in the interlanguage. And they see that there is some sort of pattern. If the investment or the motivational factors of the learners are similar, then there are similar changes in the interlanguage, and the similar aspects of language are picked up, and the differences that occur are on the basis of the social factors, and how those social factors determine the identity investment or identity ideals that people have in mind. The missing aspect in this approach is that it does not highlight any kind of formal rules that interlanguage follows. As in all approaches, we see that there are some positive things and there are some shortcomings. What we need to do as teachers and as researchers is actually try to understand the phenomena that we come across or the classroom situations we come across and try to see which is the ones that speak to our hearts, which is the one that makes sense to us, and how can we understand what is going on in our classrooms.